Hello, everyone. I'm Lakai Newman with SoDA. Thank you for joining today's call. We're joined by our friends and organizational partners at Productive to chat through detecting blind spots in agency operations and workflow. We'll address questions and offer some best practices for people and project management, sales and profitability reporting, and demand planning to help you bridge the short and long term. A few notes before we begin. We are recording today's call to return highlights to you and your teams. Please feel free to ask questions, share your thoughts and reactions in the chat, and we will do our best to address all questions and capture ideas for future discussions. This conversation is for you. It's designed to be an open discussion, so please chime in and chime in often. You do have the ability to mute and unmute yourself, so just be mindful of background noise as we move through the conversation. And lastly, if you haven't, we hope that you'll join us on video. It makes for a richer discussion. With that being said, I'll turn it over to Gabby to get us going.
Thanks, Lakai. So hi, everyone. I'm Gabriela, Senior Biz Dev at Productive, and I'm really excited to be with you today. At Productive, I speak with over 150 digital agencies on a monthly basis. And over the past 5 years that I've been with Productive, certain blind spots and patterns have crystallized during that time. In crisis times like these, we all know that we are in recession right now, increased inflation. People tend to focus on just one thing, like chasing profit or good cash flow, and lose sight of other important areas of their agency. That is when things can easily get even more chaotic, even though you're trying to make something better for your agency. We know that you cannot always be on top of everything because you have a limited time and resources. So we've brought together a few key pillars that we think you should keep an eye on, and we'd like to have a discussion on these. So feel free to chime in and add your comments as we go along. We'll go through them one by one, and we'd love to hear your opinions. Which brings me to my first topic, which is securing new business. So when we're experiencing volatile economic periods, what happens often in agencies is that the best solution to solving crisis problems is laying off people, which is happening right now, or your team is stuck on bench because you don't have enough work secured for them and you have overstaffed during the previous phase. People sitting on the bench often actually happens because there's a poor communication between sales and operations. And this actually brings us to the blind spot that we're seeing right now among many agencies, and that is building a sustainable and bulletproof business development process. So when things are going good, you have enough leads coming in, enough secure business for the next couple of months, it's easy to relax and say, I don't need to focus on business development that much, which is actually not true. You always need to work on maintaining your pipeline busy for the next couple of months and having a lot of deals in the pipeline, even if that means you have to say no to some deals, which is perfectly fine, but you need to make sure you have enough steady work coming in and enough inquiries. You need to keep working on that. When crisis time happen, you have something in the pipeline that you can start working on instead of putting people on the bench or even worse, firing them. So we think that just because you have enough work right now doesn't mean that you shouldn't invest time and resources into a new business process. And that is something that we see as a learning lesson for a lot of agencies during crisis periods to kind of start focusing on your business. Then the crisis ends, then they just stop focusing on that. So just when we get out of this one, hopefully, make sure you continue investing in new business for sure. Does anyone want to chime in on this one, perhaps?
Yeah, Gabby, I was just going to weigh in from a SoDA perspective, and I'd be curious to hear from some of you guys on the call. You know, we've been tracking within the SoDA community kind of pipeline activity this year, and we've certainly seen, you know, and it depends agency by agency, but you know, generally pipelines have been more volatile in Q1 and Q2. In some cases, it's a matter of pipeline volume is just down. Number of leads and dollar volume of the pipeline are down. In other cases, it's the volume of the pipeline is pretty decent, but deals are taking a really long time to close. And I'm curious from the group, especially as we start to kind of head into Q2. And if anyone just wants to weigh in, please, unmute the mic. It's helpful to hear from what others are experiencing in the business right now. What are you kind of seeing in terms of pipeline activity? And also how are you kind of responding to it? Do you feel like you've got enough visibility into your pipeline, to make proactive decisions that you need to make? And I think that's one of the things we're going to be talking about in some of these other topics today, is just getting ahead of the situation enough, that you can make proactive decisions. So anyone want to just, this is an open conversation. Don't feel like you need to share anything super confidential or proprietary, but I'm just curious, what are others experiencing with pipelines right now? Are they seeing more volatility? And any tactics you're kind of doing to navigate that right now? And I might call on a SoDA person just to put them on the spot, just to get a little bit of conversation going. So you can be mad at me later. Jim from Reason, I'm going to call. Plus, I haven't heard your lovely Lilteen voice in a while, so I'd love to hear just how you guys are kind of navigating, the current situation, and is pipeline visibility a challenge right now?
I think there has been a little bit of feet dragging, a little bit harder to sign stuff off. But we signed a great project on Friday. It is happening.
Yeah.
I think that's probably due to an investment in client services in general, and just having really patient, capable client services going after, like more patient than me, going after stuff. That's actually paying off. I think 2 years ago, when we were really at the inception of that team, we weren't really sure how long until we're going to get a payback, and they are now delivering for us in otherwise pretty tough general landscape, I'd say. And there's a lot of cost pressure, and we're acting on that by trying to scale a lot more from nearshore. I'm sure everyone's doing that.
I was just going to say that's a really good point to make, because I think I get asked about this a lot, because we have pipeline discussions within the SoDA community often, and or biz dev discussions, and people are always looking for kind of the silver bullet. And one of the things I tell members consistently is, one, there is no silver bullet, and two, I think that the one tactic that we all know is important, in that many of us are guilty of not adhering to, which is a consistent ongoing development or investment focus, attention to business development in good times and bad. Despite, no matter how well we sort of know that in our heads, there's a natural cadence often in our businesses to get busy, and then we're focused only on that and not on the pipeline. And there's a general sense that when the market starts to slow down, there's crap, we've got to focus all of our attention here now, which is natural. But the reality is that a healthy degree, a healthy amount of attention should be being placed there all the time. And I think, Jim, your analogy is a good one, is that, a lot of this stuff is long lead. It's going to take 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, maybe even to pay off. And if you're just starting on those efforts as a slowdown is starting to take hold, you're probably in for some lag time until you start to see results. But thank you for sharing that, Jim. Anyone else just want to share just on the pipeline front right now, or any shifts that you feel like you've had to make in the last couple months to, get smarter about pipeline visibility and demand generation? All right, well, we can move on from that topic for now, but if you feel free to use the chat window if you've got suggestions to add on that front. But again, I think it's important to take away, and I feel like I learned this in every downturn, and I have to learn it again, which is always paying attention and investing, in business development and account growth. It's actually the investments during the good times that are going to pay off when you're starting to hit some of the tougher times, rather than waiting until the tougher times to really double down there.
Yeah, and as you said yourself, consistency is the key here. It's like working on your summer body in May, right? Doesn't make sense. You need to work on your summer body your whole year. The same thing happens with your pipeline. You need to work on your pipeline the whole time. Good times, bad times, when you're busy, when you're not busy. You need to have a steady income of leads. Otherwise, you might not make it the next time the new crisis hits. Well, with people sitting on a bench, let's move over to the next pillar, which is resource planning and forecasting. This is something that we talk about a lot at Productive. We're seeing this as one of the key blind spots for just maintaining the entire agency lifecycle in harmony. That's how you achieve it, right? The fundamental tool or mechanism for achieving that harmony is successful resource planning and forecasting, making sure that people have just enough work, they're not overworking themselves, they're not sitting on the bench, they're not costing you, right? Because they're not generating any billable revenue. So in the last year, we're actually conducting a global agency survey together with SoDA. And in this survey, we have questioned around 150 agencies. And generally, agencies were self-aware that they could improve in certain areas. But we found that attracting and retaining the talent was a top priority for 49% of the agencies. That means that accurately planning and forecasting future scenarios is a huge pain point for every other digital agency out there. And we know that agencies that start planning hiring on time do get the top talent. And many of the agencies that we work with have actually noticed happier teammates when they have work allocated for them in advance, like 6 or 8 weeks, and then knowing what they will work on just a week in advance. People just feel more confident, more at ease when they know what the future is holding for them and what kind of projects they'll be working on. So I would just love to hear some of the best practices among SoDA members on resource planning and how they're managing this process internally, because it's a key process for any agency. Yeah, Luca, go on.
Hi, so first of all, I'm Luca from Infinom, and my role there is a planning director, which basically means that I'm managing a schedule for more than 350 people. So Infinom is part of SoDA as of recently, so I just wanted to say that I'm happy to be on board and happy to be here with you guys. And yeah, what I wanted to say is that when it comes to forecasting and resource management, I think it all comes down to professionalizing how are you doing this, and that comes down to maybe 3 or 4 steps. The first thing would be to make this someone's job. So in bigger agencies like Infinom, you have planning departments, which means that you have guys like me and people in planning which do this full time. If you're a smaller agency, this doesn't have to be, a full-time person working on it, but I think it's smart to give this task to either some of the founders or to a PM or somebody who can tackle something like this. I think it should be a repeatable process because there needs to be a steady and consistent process around the key metrics, what you're tracking and what you are reporting on. And that can be stuff like, your monthly utilization overview and your forecast, like production capacities. And I think that you need tooling to make this possible, to have everything in line. And speaking of the first topic, in terms of sales and biz dev, I think that, planning department or whoever is in charge of resource management really needs to be aligned with biz dev. That's what we do here in Infinom. So we forecast and we signal to the biz devs which teams are having like a tougher time with the utilization in the upcoming period. So we need more emphasis on that, and we need to sell more more specific technologies, or we can signal that we're full in some teams and that we need to communicate bigger lead times. So like also in the times of crisis like we had in the first quarter, we really were aligned and we brought emphasis to the cooperation between biz dev and planning to overcome this. And I think we've done this successfully, at least for now. We'll see what the rest of the year will bring.
Cool. That seems like a really streamlined process. Does anyone want to add something or has any questions for me? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, I don't work for any agency. I work as freelancers for agencies. And what I see is that agencies often do have a tendency to plan, but don't have actually the right commitment, especially when they have very few clients and those clients start to dictate their tempo. So what I see is that agencies often want to plan. I work as a product manager. They call me often to their company meetings, asking me what do I have in my pipeline as a product manager and how they can put it in theirs. And I say very, let's say, objectively, how and what to do, what should I do, giving them advices and stuff like that. As well do my colleagues that are project managers that have many clients under them. But often what I see is that agencies kind of ask you, but don't listen. And if they say that they do listen, often they actually don't have any commitment at all. So I don't know where's the gap between listening and actually committing, because if you're asking, I would say, consider myself people in the field, why not actually considering their input like for real and adjust their pipeline? Because what I often see is that once those pipelines are not maintained, because as Luca said, we have to have people that are working all the time on them, then after 2 or 3 months, even my roadmap that I have, for example, on my plate goes bust. So that's what I wanted to add to this.
That's an interesting perspective. Luca, what dictates your pipeline and the way you're allocating resources, pushing projects, moving timelines around, roadmaps, etc.?
I mean, for the most part, it's the ongoing business. We have like more than 150 currently active projects where it's dynamic and we need to fill those needs as a priority. And then it's the pipeline and the deals that come soonest to the schedule. So we're like trying to find the perfect balance between the supply and demand. And in terms of like some negative scenarios and in terms of like commitments, I would say it's hard, but you need to do like a scenario analysis and just you need to be prepared for multiple scenarios. So we try to do this even with a fixed schedule where we know everything and where our utilization is good. We maybe think of some bad scenarios and how would we react, and how would we react if a portion of our capacity suddenly frees up and scenarios like that. So just trying to be proactive about some negative things.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to go back to something that Luca said earlier on, having a process around resource planning. Infinum is actually a sister company of Productive. Productive started first as an internal tool that helped them manage their agency. So we used to work closely together. And I remember that when they had around 60 people, now they have 350. That's when they introduced the first resource planning person. So the person whose full-time job was doing resource planning. They didn't have as efficient tools back then, so it was a lot of manual work, but that I think is a good benchmark on when you're asking yourself whether we need to hire someone full-time to do this. When you have from 60 to 100 people, you definitely should start considering hiring someone to do this full-time or for a majority of their capacity. That's for sure.
Yeah, I'll Gabby, I'll weigh in on that. I've ran an agency before. I was in this role at SoDA, and we had good tools and good data in our systems for resource planning. But I think that until we hired a few dedicated resource planning people, we couldn't really get it dialed in, because there's always things in between the cracks that the data in the dashboard's not going to cover. And needing to talk to the creative leads, needing to talk to the production leads, and getting kind of like the real sense of when a deliverable is going to be wrapped up. Is this piece on track? Are we talking about like you can roll off next week, or is it 2 weeks? And filling in that data that you get from your systems with a lot of live conversations is really, really critical for nimble, more nimble resource planning. And I was going to ask a question back to you, Gabby. I was curious, and everyone's working model is different. So I know there's not in working model in terms of like the project types they work on, what the durations of those are, how long teams get assigned, et cetera. But when you look at either agencies you work with or agencies you talk to, what do you think is like a healthy practice in terms of like how far out should you be able to kind of like realistically? I mean, again, every pieces are moving all the time, but with some reasonable, degree of insight.
Yeah.
Like I know in our data, in our study we did together, there were some who responded and said, oh, we can forecast accurately out to 9 months, which I thought was just crazy. And like the only way I could see that happening would be is if it's like retained team, like entirely retained teams or something like that. So I know that that's not the, that's not the prevailing experience probably within most of the, agencies on this call. But what would you say is like it just is a healthy starting point? Like how far should you be able to project out with some reasonable degree of certainty?
Well, that's a good question. I think a reasonable projection would be 3 months ahead, seeing what's in your future for the next 3 months. If you can get the data, that's great, because this gives you enough time span to react if you see some of your services are not that sold. So those people will be sitting on the bench, then you can land it with your sales team, go out selling their services more. You can hire people on time, hire contractors. If you're doing it like 3 or 4 weeks in advance, this doesn't give you that much of an advantage. And I know this is very much different for every industry. In software development, they can plan way more ahead, way more compared to marketing agencies, for example, where work is so hectic. But let's say 3 months would be ideal as a starting point. And then if you can expand that, that's great, because this will give you more visibility. You can connect it to some other things like revenue forecasting, or building a long-term hiring plan. So yeah, I think that's reasonable, at least as a starting point. Now, it really depends on your business reality, of course. And then the second thing is what Lucas said, like adjusting the process. So all of the data is nonsense if you don't update it constantly, because you cannot hold on to that initial projection if that is not being updated, because timelines shift. Clients change their minds, projects get put on hold, people quit, they get sick, reality happens. So once you make that projection, you need to update it constantly, that's for sure. But it could be a good guidance for a lot of internal processes.
Yeah. I'm curious from this group, if anyone wants to speak to it. I just would be curious to hear some perspective of whether those on this call find it more challenging to manage kind of changes in resourcing when you're growing quickly, because that obviously presents a certain challenge, or when your pipeline is slow and or unpredictable, and you're trying to figure out how to staff or make staffing adjustments. Is anyone finding like the current time actually as challenging is when you're quickly growing? Anyone?
I can add, maybe nobody wants to speak. For example, what I see that is challenging is that even though there is a 3-month forecast being planned, and it will happen, it will go by the plan, I see it often that by the end of that 3rd month, there is nobody talking about the next 3 months. And what usually happens is that those 3 months finish, we deliver what we committed to, and then we need at least a month and a half to plan the next 3 months. So that's also what I have is like, it's more or less like waterfall, but it shouldn't be, the planning should be like agile. Even once you have a plan of 3 months, okay, that's it, you're starting already to think about those next 3 months. But what I see often is that people kind of enter into the comfort zone, and they say, okay, we know what we are doing for the next 3 months. That's it. We're now gonna rest a bit, have stress relief, and everything will go fine. And then those 3 months pass very fast, and there's no plan for the next period.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like planning your resources is not planning your strategic goals for the quarter or for the whole year. You don't sit in a room for 10 days, plan them out, and then go out in the world. It's a process that's happening constantly. This means that today you're planning for the next 3 months and then the week after that as well. It's not like you make a plan for the next 3 months and then you don't know what happens after that. It's something that happens constantly. It's a steady process. That's why you need to have tools and people in place that will support that.
Yeah.
Kind of management.
And I would say, I guess the things that I've experienced and I'm hearing in particularly these kinds of times is that the challenge from resource planning particularly is it comes in a couple directions. Is one, you know, if you're facing a situation where you might need to make staffing adjustments, those are obviously hard decisions to make. And, you know, for most people running agencies, they want to, you know, they want to delay those for as long as is reasonable. And part of that has been exacerbated by kind of what's happened in the talent market over the last couple of years. Talent market has been so competitive. And I know so many agencies that I've chatted with it, they're like, we've spent so much time and effort getting like the right people in the right seats, you know, in a lot of ways. And they're obviously very loath to let go of anyone. And so having like a real visibility into what that picture looks like, I think is very important for timing of business decisions. And also for, you know, for some who've been just weighing the trade-offs of going, how long do I hold on to certain talent, knowing that it was very difficult to acquire that talent in the first place. And the other thing I'll just mention, an interesting data point from our digital outlook study with Forrester coming into the year, is it looked like a lot of agencies were at least already planning. You know, I think many we talked to had started to see like a little bit of slowdown maybe in Q3 or Q4. And while many were still projecting some revenue growth for this year, the vast bulk of agencies in our survey were not planning to add full-time headcount. They were coming into the year already planning to use more freelancers, in some cases use offshore partners for development, but basically mechanisms that gave them a little bit more flexibility in the staffing and resourcing model. And I think, you know, for those that were maybe ahead of that by a few months, that certainly could be, you know, a helpful position to be in.
Yeah, and both perspectives totally make sense. You know, holding on to your talent is understandable, even if it's costing you a lot, because talent is your major asset when you're an agency, right? Your people and the time you've invested into them, to training them, getting them, you know, to a level where they are right now. It's hard to let go of people, and that's completely understandable. Would anyone else like to comment on this any further, or should we move on to the next pillar?
I guess we can move on.
Okay, thanks. Cool. Well, the next pillar that we wanted to bring up was profitability and cost management. I mean, this one is pretty obvious. Regardless of the type of the business that you're running, it's important that you're making a profit, and that's just common sense. So,
yeah, so maybe I can weigh in here as well with our agency study that we did with SoDA last year. I wanted to just add in with another comment that I'm Maria. I'm actually in Productive, Teams Productive in marketing. I speak with a lot of agency leaders and owners. And so one of the interesting findings that we found last year was that over half of agencies, speaking of profitability and cost management, didn't have any kind of real-time data analysis of business health, didn't have any kind of really insight of a pulse of their business. So though we're, you know, what we found was, though we're in this high-paced industry with so many growing appetites and complexity of service offered, the findings showed us that really there's still a lot of room for improvement in monitoring profitability and where we're going with the expenses that we have. So yeah, this also influences many other business decisions, right, Gabby?
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, most of your business decisions will be driven by how much profit you've made and how much profit you have at your hands you can invest further on. For example, now that we're in times of crisis, if you have a lot of profit from previous periods, especially if it's in cash, you can really invest it into making some big decisions like acquiring a new agency or hiring top talent that has been laid off by another company. And, in the previous year, it was hard to track the talent. Now it's hard to keep the talent. So if you've made extra profit, you definitely have an advantage there to make some talent decisions that will ultimately pay off in a longer period. Well, going back to what you've said, MK, that some agencies, actually a lot of agencies, don't have data on their profit. There are also a lot of agencies that do have financial data at their fingertips, so they could easily track down the profit margin of every single client, but their blind spot is actually not acting upon it. So they do see that some clients are not as profitable, but they're kind of overlooking the profitability for the sake of maintaining a certain client because they're a big brand, because they're a great name, they're a good reference. And it's okay if you do that for a while because it helps you build your business in the longer term. And, it's nice to see their name on your website. But if you keep doing that for a longer period, straining profit out of your company, you're basically giving your work away for free. And it's going to be harder and harder to actually start charging them for all the things that you're giving them for free. So actually, there was an anecdote with one of our customers at Productive who had realized that they were using the blended rate model for quite a while, which is very popular among agencies. And sometimes the blended rate works for you, sometimes it doesn't. So their strategy was focusing on really big clients for several years. And what they realized when they've had the data at their fingertips is that certain clients were always requiring more senior resources, right? And you're charging everyone at the same rate, but your senior resources are costing you way more. So what they ended up realizing is that this client is a great name, but they're also giving them a lot of their own profit. And, they're not really making a margin on them. So ultimately, they moved away from the blended rate. This doesn't have to be the case for everyone, but it is something that you should consider because we tend to always overservice the bigger clients or give them the best talent that we have because we want to keep them happy. Does anyone else have any similar experiences with blended rate or a different experience perhaps? I know it's quite popular in the SoDA community.
I think one thing I've been surprised about is that so few people in our business are really commercial thinkers, and it's not actually that common a skill. And another challenge I found here is that I might feel like I've got a rough understanding of where profit is in the business, but unless I'm really telling that story, other people will make their own bad assumptions. So I actually need to even tell the story because other people just see, oh, the contractor spend is too high. And the challenges are always actually more sophisticated than that. But, profit's another one of those things where there's not a silver bullet, right? It's actually a whole bunch of different factors.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Jim. Because we're in a creative industry, a lot of the agents that I talk to, especially in Europe, where we have a lot of customers, tend to think that profit is a dirty word. So for example, one of the key things that Productive offers is, really good insights into how much profit you're making on a specific client or a project. And when that's something that I offer them as an insight, they're like, no, that's just not how we run our business. Mm-hmm. I'm like, are you running an NGO or, it's a creative business, but you still need to make a profit. You have the responsibility towards your employees that you're going to make a profit. They're going to secure their jobs for the next couple of months or years, and you're going to make sure that they're paid fairly, right? And you cannot do that without a profit. So, here in Europe, it's still, a dirty word, as I've said, tracking profit, measuring profit. This doesn't mean you're greedy. It's just making sure that your projects are healthy and you have stable income that is going to come the next couple of months. So there's nothing bad to it. But I definitely see your point, Jim. There's a lot of us in the industry that don't really care about profit, let's say so.
Well, and I would just add, and then I see someone who's raising a hand, so we'll get to them. But yeah, Jim, I mean, I think it's a really, really great point, and something that's come up in our recent conversations too. I don't know, you might have attended the session we had with Blair Enns and Tim Williams on pricing. And it's a similar sensibility. It's like, really, when you think about it, like very few of us are experts at pricing strategies in negotiation. We've not studied it. We've not really looked at it. Like, many of us have adopted pricing models that are, accepted conventions within the business, and that's all fine. But I think knowing that that's a blind spot is an important step to take. And I tell, Gabby, I'll often tell members that, you should want the visibility into where the health in the business is. You still don't have to act on it. Like, if your biggest client, which is your prestige client, and you're making a 2% margin on it, but you love the work, and maybe it attracts other clients for you, etc. You should know that information so that you can make informed decisions on it. It doesn't mean that you have to make every decision to maximize profit on every client account. But again, I think it is a big, I would say, project-based, profitability and account-based profitability are still pretty big blind spots within a lot of agencies. Yeah. Maybe not those of you on this call. I mean, there are plenty that are at that level. But in all honesty, it's like, if you can't get to that point where you're understanding the projects that are the most profitable and the client accounts that are the most profitable, it's really sort of hard to tackle agency profitability at an amorphous aggregate level. Because again, as Jim said, it's way more nuanced than that. Like, you can just go, it's like, oh, our utilization rate's 5% down, that's our problem. That's too facile of a diagnosis. Yes, that's probably a contributing factor. But, I think at the end of the day, for those of you running agencies and running these businesses, you want that visibility, if for nothing else, to give you more tools and insights on how to make decisions, even if you don't make different ones.
Yeah, definitely. Christian wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a simple thing that mostly agencies, what in my opinion do have to concentrate on is who and when will pull the plug. I mean, you have to know when it's time to stop. And what I have seen is that even though they had profitability measurement, they were still afraid to pull the plug. And what happened, for example, in an agency that I was working at last year, they went into more than 100,000 euros minus in debt, and they at 105 they pulled the plug, and I was like, why didn't you pull it at 50 or 40 or 30? Well, so they said we thought that we were going to manage it, but that's actually, they were afraid, they didn't have that threshold defined. Okay, at this point we'll pull the plug if we see that it's going down.
Yeah, the same thing with pulling a plug on a client, right? We've experienced some of our users firing some of their oldest clients because they realized, okay, it's been for years that we haven't made a profit with this client. It's time to say goodbye. It's not an easy conversation. It's not easy to make that decision, but sometimes you need to do it for the sake of your own agency and, maintaining a healthy business. And as we've said, that there are some agencies that don't track profit at all. They don't have mechanisms or tools in place, or even if they do have them, they're not going to act upon it because profit is not their key metric. There are other agencies on the spectrum that have actually embodied agency project profitability into their compensation model. So, for example, they're constantly tracking which projects are the most profitable ones or are exceeding the targets, and then they're rewarding those project managers managing those projects or the whole team working on it. And it doesn't have to be, a paid weekend at the villa. It can be anything you want, but it's also important to embody this as a part of the culture. I know, for example, maybe Luca can comment on this, but I know that at Infinum, it's not like the creatives are constantly stressed about the profit of a project, but they are aware that the time that they're spending, the scope which they're exceeding is gonna be reflected in the end profit. And if the end profit is satisfactory, they might expect a reward. And we've seen this among some agencies. It's working very well because at the end of the day, everyone is kind of working towards that profit, not just the person managing the budget of the project. But it is quite progressive, let's say. We're not seeing many agencies working like that yet.
I think we sort of struggled to make that cultural leap of like how transparent should the whole of the core team see profit in a single project, right? It's a leap that we haven't been able to make, but I think we suffer for it, and certainly even in some cases, a delivery manager won't even really be aware of the project is fixed price, or there is a fixed budget at some point, which is massively to our detriment. So we're not nailing that at all.
Yeah, that is a concern among many agencies. Should we expose the data or not? I mean, that's an internal discussion. It also depends on your culture and how transparent in general you are with your team. Maybe you don't have to reveal the exact dollar figures. Maybe you could reveal the margins and just make sure everyone works towards target margin. It really depends on the culture of the company itself. But in general, what we've seen in our experience, more transparency just brings more clarity into work and improves your culture. It's not like people start, fighting over bigger benefits if they see the profit. Because they need to understand the bigger picture. What does that profit serve for? How do we invest it in our team? Because the more profit they make, they'll have better benefits. You're going to invest more in them. Maybe they'll get a salary increase, etc. It's kind of a bigger conversation, but it is a question that every agency owner asks himself or herself. Does anyone else want to bring their perspective to this? Okay, well, there's another minor blind spot connected to profitability that I've noticed over the years working at Productive. And I've seen that a lot of agencies actually don't factor in the cost or the investment of time and money it took them to gain a client, right? So especially if they're pitching for big clients. So that's sometimes months of work that involves like a bigger team working on the pitch, investing their hours and hours into the concept, into the presentation. And then it's great. You want a big new client. It's a $1 million contract, but you've never factored in the hundreds of hours that actually took you into winning that client. So I was wondering if you have a process around that. Is this something that you consider when you're looking at client profit at all? How much it took you, so your investment to win that client in the first place, or as they call it, the cost of client acquisition.
So Gabby, I would just, and I don't have the number in front of me. I'll have to go back to it, but we've tracked this in the past, and I would, and people on the call, you can either nod or raise your hand or whatever, but I would say that I think that the actual cost of the actual the cost of a sale is a hard item to track, and not many agencies have a good handle on it.
Yeah.
And I know that in the past, like when we've asked members of like, which metrics are you not tracking that you would like to do a better job of tracking, cost of sales is always one of the, always one of the higher ones. I mean, on one hand, I feel like if you're tracking time accurately and, and that's the bulk of the sales efforts, then it shouldn't be so difficult. But then there are subjective parts of the sales process too, that if you're really trying to look at what's, it's like if you're working on an RFP, sure, you can put your time in to the RFP, you can kind of calculate that and understand. But I'm just reflecting that I know within the community and a lot of discussions I've had that like the true cost of sales or cost of a sale is a fairly big blind spot for a number of agencies I talk to.
Rebecca wanted to share her opinion on this one. She raised her
Yeah, I
hand.
was just thinking the way that we do it, at least, is that we track time spent for every pitch that we take part in. And if we would win it, then we also keep track of when, I mean, depending on the type of the project or the collaboration, it could be a long-term thing, and then you could look at it as an investment over a longer period of time. But you could also look at it like, can we recoup some of that? Can we fold that into the first project? And if we can't fold everything in, we can keep track of when do we break even? When are we actually starting to make money? So I think that's really important to try to do, at least. And it also gives some kind of indication of how much your new client is valuing what you're delivering. Because all the time that you've spent into the pitch is also worth something. It's not like you can just park that and then start billing for it, for the work that you start doing once you win the pitch.
Yeah. And I would assume you also include your most expensive resources into the pitch preparation.
Oh, yes, definitely. And maybe you can't recoup everything, but you should at least be able to track it, not just close your eyes to it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Rebecca. I mean, just having that data is priceless. You don't have to act upon it. You don't have to immediately stop attending pitches because they're not profitable. But it would be good that at least you start tracking that, so you're aware of it. I would like to.
Oh, I was just going to mention, I think with some agencies, there's a sensibility that that business development or the pitch process is sort of an expectation that's embedded into your working time. And so to some extent that there's not a real opportunity cost that's been lost there, although there always is, right? But to the extent that it's like, oh, I'm a creative director and I'm working on this pitch, but I'm not foregoing billable hours by working on this because I'm still working on all the stuff that, I still was supposed to be billing. And I think that while that might be true for a number of agencies, i.e. that you're actually not giving up billable hours to work on a new business pitch, because those billable hours may not be there, that it's still critical to know that information. But I guess I'm just reflecting on, I think that's a mentality that a lot of people I know sort of adopt, is that, again, it's sort of an embedded idea of cost in the business and how we manage our resources, and that we don't track it as accurately because we're just expected, when there is business to go after, you go after business in addition to, the things that you're normally doing. But it doesn't set, and again, even if you continue to operate in that way, I would just argue that it's better to know that information so that you can just make more informed choices around, as you're pursuing new business, like what to be, we definitely had, big pieces of business that we've pursued over time that it was like several $100,000 in hours. It was, huge teams working on multiple rounds of pitches. And I think if we would, I don't know that we would have changed the behavior, but going into it, knowing that would have been good. Like those were tough pills to swallow sort of after the fact, when you really, really looked at some of the time that was sunk into them.
Putting money into that perspective is really important, because, just looking at 700 hours, maybe it sounds a lot, but when you put it into $70,000, it sounds as a bigger issue for sure. And you could have put that money somewhere else.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's another point that I would like to get back to. So Christian mentioned that example of a company that, ended the year in debt because they didn't pull the plug when they should have. And what I've personally seen during the years is that the most successful agencies are not even, having profit data that comes too late at the end of the project, because then it's too late to do something, or tracking the profit in real time when you can still react. They're actually having a completely proactive approach, and they're forecasting their profit at the beginning of the project based on all of the resources they're going to invest into it. And this is a model that has become more and more popular over the last years. And it's a model that really gives you a lot of time spent to react on time if you spot that your profit margin is not going to be what you expected it to be or what you would like it to be. And it kind of brings a lot of ease to the people who are managing the projects, because they can anticipate the future and they can really act upon it, you know, change the scope or the resources they're going to invest, or just, you know, have more control over it. So I was wondering if any of you are maybe using that model to manage the profit of your projects.
Can you explain exactly what you mean by that? I don't think I really understood.
No worries. So I was referring to the process of forecasting the profit margin of your project when you start working on it. So let's say you have a project coming in, you allocate all of your resources that you're planning to invest in the project. And then based on that, based on the resources you've allocated and the budget that the client has given you, you're comparing what your profit is going to be. So do you have a process like that in place where you estimate your profit at the beginning?
Doesn't everyone?
Maybe
I'm stupid here. But I mean, you have an estimate in the beginning, right? So you think, okay, this is how much time we're going to spend on the project. These are the people. And then you know, if everything goes according to plan, which it never does, this is where we're going to end up. And so then you start tracking weekly when people fill out their timesheets. Are we on time? And then you almost always see that you're always overspending on time.
Do you base that initial estimate on the internal cost of those people? So specific salary cost of those people?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
I would say.
That sounds like a good process. So you do take that as a benchmark or an orientation?
I mean, it's not something that we look at constantly, but the finance department does. So they see in the system how we're tracking against what we're planning. But I mean, from a project management perspective, we're not looking at what are we costing as opposed to what are we charging the client. We're only looking at hours spent versus hours estimated. Sorry, I think I interrupted someone. I didn't mean to.
No, not at all, Rebecca. It's a good point, because I would say that is. I mean, it goes back to some of that transparency comment Jim and Gabby were making earlier. I mean, I think that a lot of production teams don't necessarily have access to the cost structure of the team, right? And so, you know, you might just assume that there's a particular margin built in, or maybe that is, at a certain level of transparency that could be communicated to the team too, that it's like, if we deliver this project with these resources for these hours, you know, we're expecting X margin. But that's, I would, I understand that for most project, like the production teams aren't going to have that detailed cost visibility into it. But I would imagine that most, and we'll get some hands raised here, I'd say, so from our perspective, it's like we obviously knew what our month-over-month cost structure was. And even just at the simplest level, you can project out your revenue, and the timing of the revenue just to get a future profitability forecast, even if it's not down to the project, the project level.
Luke, I think you raised your hand first, so.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's connected to resource management, and people doing the resource management should be at least to a degree aware of the cost structures, because they're the one building the things. So that's what we also do, like in Infinom. You don't have to be like fully aware, but at least to some degree, because if you build a team that's too senior, you may start a project with a minus to begin with. which is definitely like a bad scenario. And then if we consider it as a strategic investment, and if it's like generally acceptable, then okay, we can move forward. But sometimes we really need to adapt while fitting the teams with, you know, cost also in mind. So yeah, I think it's really important to do this even on this level.
Christian, you also wanted to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to actually join the two things that Rebecca and Tom said. So Rebecca said time entries and Tom said detail. Usually I see that agencies have time tracking tools, for example, yours, Productive, but often the time entries, meaning the actual label of the time entry, is too generic. And once they do need to have a detailed analysis, where the time actually was spent on, what was spent on, they can, because they simply have a, for example, I just log under PM time and that's it. But nobody asked me whether or not it was PM time with the developers or I spent time with the client. So once they do need to have a breakdown, they can't. They have a PM time. That's it. So that's all.
Point. Jim, what did you want to say?
I mean, we sort of had this funny thing where our project statements of work would go out into a channel and they'd be reviewed by leadership, and there always be this comment, oh great, it's 40% margin. It's going to be 40% margin every single time because it's just costed with rate card against our cost. It's always that. And, you know, this idea of a commercial person reviews it and approves it is just kind of a bit silly. We've got, I think one thing I'd love to play with, and we haven't got there yet, would be looking at kind of normalizing the number of days in the month and even trying to report profit on a per day basis or a day average for the month. Here in the UK, 23 working days in March, 18 in April. That's a 20% drop in revenue just because there's such fewer days in April. And most commercial people or finance people don't even look at that. They just go, why is revenue down 20%? What's on fire? So, you know, trying to normalize all this stuff and getting really more reporting weekly or daily, I'm trying to work out how I push the finance team to look at that. Yeah, but I think it's easy to take a very superficial view at profit.
That's a really big blind spot. You're absolutely right, Jim. And if you actually align the forecasting with the resourcing, you would see that. You would see the number of working hours that have been planned for the team, and you would see that drop because there are less working days, or you would see a drop because there's a vacation season. So in August, we all experience desert basically, because half of the team is away and there's way less billable hours. If you work on time and materials model, that's something that you should anticipate because you're going to experience less billable hours, less revenue, therefore less cash is going to come in September. So that is something that your team should be aligned around, especially if you're a bigger agency, because then the drops are costing you even more. Does anyone else want to add something to the profitability pillar, or should we move over to the next one? I think it's safe to say we can move to the next one. We're almost behind the schedule. I didn't expect that people are going to have so many comments, which is great. I was expecting a lot of radio silence, so I'm really glad that everyone's participating. Well, the last pillar that we're going to cover today is cash flow and payments, a really hot topic right now. It's always a hot topic during crisis times, and it's something that you should manage in good times as well, but now it's becoming more and more important. We've talked about forecasting revenue just earlier on, a few seconds ago, and it kind of connects to this. If you're not able to forecast revenue, it's really hard to plan for your cash flow and to manage it properly. Last time we did the SoDA report, we've seen that only 43% of agencies actually had some data on forecasted revenue, which means that most of the agencies actually cannot predict their cash flow or investments in the upcoming quarter. And I've earlier said on, if you can have some cash in place, some bank reserve, or you anticipate a lot of cash coming in, you can make some riskier decisions that are going to cost less now, like attracting top talent or acquiring a new agency, so you can acquire some new skills and services to offer to your portfolio. If you don't have good cash situation, it's going to be much harder for you. I mean, that's something that we all know. Even if you cannot forecast your revenue, it would be good that you at least streamline the process around invoicing. We're seeing a lot of agencies that still spend like 2 or 3 days per month. Thank you, Luca, for participation. We're seeing a lot of agencies that spend like 2 or 3 days in a month to close the month and to do the whole invoicing process. And actually the golden rule around the whole cash flow is the faster you invoice, the faster you're going to receive the payments. So we still see this as an area where a lot of agencies could really improve on the whole internal process around billing. Do you have similar experiences? Is invoicing still a struggle and takes you a lot of time, more than you think it should have? Rebecca, yeah.
I think this is a really tough one, because usually when we start working with new clients, we expect to start working together immediately when we've won a pitch, for instance. And then usually what happens is that they have a really complex procurement team and PO issuing. So that could take up to 4, 5, 6 weeks, sometimes worst case, for us to even be able to send the first invoice. And the timeline that we have developed together with the client usually assumes that we start working basically on day one. And we're stuck in a situation where we might have to threaten to not start working. And that's not a good start to a collaboration. And usually these clients, they say that, this is our process, this is the procurement team, this is finance team, it doesn't have anything to do with us, we're sorry, but we really need to get going. So they're so disconnected. Yeah. And there's usually zero understanding from the client perspective, because they're on the clock and they need to start showing results.
Yeah, I always feel like the procurement team is here to crush all of your dreams.
Yeah. And even if you put that into the contract, that, we can't start working until you've issued a PO. I mean, no one reads the fine print. They just want to start working.
Yeah,
I don't know if anyone else has the same experience, but
I think Tom and I were just talking about this the other day, right? Agencies really need to understand the differences between timeline and when you're starting to work and invest your own resources. So that's costing you, and when you're actually getting paid. And when you're starting off with a new client, you might get so excited about the project that you might not even properly define the invoicing schedule. So you don't really understand when you're getting paid. Nevertheless, when you're investing your own time. So this is a common.
And all of a sudden you see that they have 90 days payment terms.
Right.
Oh.
And it's like, okay, we're already 6 weeks behind and you're planning on paying the first invoice after 90 days. And it's like, that's our policy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and I think that is a problem, Rebecca, for a lot of companies, and again, it's even more argument to have a really, really strong handle on your forecast and your cash position, because it in some cases, if 90-day payment terms, like you might want that client, you might need that client, and you may have no ability to negotiate that otherwise. So on the business side of the equation, when you're taking that business, you need to understand what cash deficit that's going to create, at least in the interim, until payments start, coming in. But the best antidote, I think, is obviously just having as clear contracts as possible. And I always advise people, it's a lot easier to have those tougher, unpleasant conversations in the contract phase than it is once you start the work. So don't start the work. Don't start the work till the contract is, don't start the work till the contract is in place.
Yeah.
Have those hard conversations in the contract, so that when you really are legitimately starting work, there's not a lot of tension around things like payment,
But usually you don't start to talk about contracts until at the very end of that pitch or that first discussions, when you show creative work and you start showing timelines and budgets and yada yada, but you're not showing the full contract. So once you go into contract, then it might be too late. So what we actually have started to do is to create a few slides in an onboarding deck. Is like, this is what it means to work with us. And then we talk about, you know, creative process, production process, but we also talk about the boring stuff, like setting us up in your system and stuff that needs to happen in terms of payment terms, so that they can flag that in the beginning. Because if that's a deal breaker to us, maybe we can take on the project with that kind of timeline if they're planning on paying us after 90 days.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's smart to front load it as much as possible. But again, I think you have to make a decision at the business too of, do you start work without a contract in place? Because that's just, I mean, and I know there's a lot of bad actors from a client perspective out there too, but that's just not the way any of us should be working. Like, you know, if there's not a fundamental contract in place, then the notion of starting, you know, that starting work shouldn't be on the table.
Yeah.
Anything, but to your point, when it's out of your control, anything you can do to kind of set those expectations in advance, I think is really, really, you know, is really helpful. Like you could say, hey, typically we can start work. You know, we see the contract process typically takes 2 weeks or whatever the case is. You know, so we might say, you know, we can do some briefing before that, we can get the project team set up, et cetera, but we're not, you know, our typical start time frame is 2 to X weeks based on contract cycles. And client, if you want the contract cycle to move faster, then, you know, you can help us do that.
And to Dino's point there, yes, definitely you can negotiate a discount to get an early payment, but still, if you're really, you know, pressed to a point where there are not that big of a margin, then 2 to 3% could be quite a lot. Yeah, on a big production budget. Yeah. And there might also be, you know, a client that doesn't approve any markup on third-party purchases. So you might have a really big purchase that you also need to cover for. Yeah. And so it could be really tricky. So you really need to spend time on the fine print and talking to the client early on about, you know, invoicing and stuff like that. Even if you think that, you know, it's too premature, it could really be end up being really complicated further in.
Yeah, I agree. Hey, Gabby, we have a question in the chat. I think.
Yeah, I've seen it from the. Their question was whether we believe that integrating AI would benefit if you integrate it into some internal processes. For sure, it's really early to tell that. It could definitely benefit and automate some of the internal processes. You still need to have, let's say, a human touch here as well, because you need someone who will interpret the data, give you a second perspective, a wider picture here. So we can not rely on the AI making some decisions, for example, who's going to work on the project, or what do we do about the forecasted overrun that we're seeing, but it might help. I'm also interested to see how that's going to roll out in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I would imagine, you know, this question comes from Dept. So for, you know, places like, you know, Dept and Media Monks, the larger and more complex your operation is, I think that there's going to be more, you know, more immediate advantages to having certain processes automated, just simply because there's more, you know, more complexity. I don't know that like a smaller agency is going to see, I'm not talking about producing the work at this point, like, because that's a whole other notion of, you know, if you can do a creative brief faster, et cetera. I'm just talking about the processes, like, you know, resourcing, team assignments, because sort of the operational aspects. I don't think on the operational aspects for the smaller agencies, they're going to see as many immediate benefits from, you know, from AI and automation, but certainly the larger and more complex the operation is, I think there's more opportunity to create some efficiency.
Yeah, we're receiving some similar feature requests from our users, and we do see some benefits from the AI here, but we wouldn't completely rely on the AI to do all of these decisions, like resolving all of the conflicts when it comes to resourcing or making decisions on what you're going to do when the forecast is not going according to the plan. So we would still combine someone who makes the final call, but together with the AI for sure. Yeah, I'm interested to see how this will roll out.
How many topics do you have left? I have a comment, but I won't if you have more topics to cover.
Well, this was actually our last topic. So if you have an additional comment, please go ahead.
Well, I would say that you are acquiring a client, let's say, and I can see that everybody celebrates a client acquisition. But then what Dina mentioned here in the comments, the scope of work, it's not transparently communicated to the team. I'm looking at it from my perspective. And then, for example, you don't know what has been signed, meaning you cannot manage expectations. And often what we get from account managers, they come to us and say, guys, are you finished? We have to invoice this and this. And we said, okay, but we weren't aware of that timeline. And we weren't aware that you have a 90-day time payment with your client. So it's something that you need to communicate vertically from you all the way down to the product manager, and then you can manage expectation. Other than that, if you have a contract and you have a team that won't deliver because they're not aware of that timeline, that there's no point.
Yeah, there needs to be a really streamlined kickoff between the sales team, so the biz dev and the delivery team, because if anything gets miscommunicated, some big problems might arise. Does someone have like a recipe? Have they overcome this challenge already?
Hi, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So how we solve this is we have a forecasting meeting every 2 weeks with the head of projects and the financial team, and we basically Excel sheet plan all the forecasted revenues, and then we can see our targets, and then we work around if something is delayed or not. And then the project lead it's kind of his job to communicate that with the other project managers on how to execute the plan, or if it's not executable, then manage risks with us and the finance. So just basically a sync meeting on how to basically be on track.
That's a good recipe. And how do you make sure you communicate everything to your delivery team when the project has been sold? Because we assume they weren't involved in the negotiations part. Yeah,
so from the scope part.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So we have when we sign a project, we have like a internal kickoff meeting where all the stakeholders are present and all the the expected team that will work on the project, and then we go over the key points, maybe risks, kind of expectations, what the type of the client is, like what are maybe things to look at, and yeah. But we don't share financials. We just have like budgets in percentages. How would I say? And it's tracked via their salaries and hours. So it's tracked in the back end how much each employee costs, and then the margin basically is dropping, which we call it's a budget deficit.
Okay, thank you for sharing your perspective. Okay, does someone else want to add something to this? Someone has found a golden recipe for managing cash flow? No. Yeah, this is not an easy one, that's for sure. And it's always overlooked because it's kind of like the last step in the process, but it's also the key one, because the ultimate goal is to get paid. The faster, the better. So this is something I really suggest you should have a deeper look into. Well, this discussion was very active. I'm really glad to have so many participants, so many people sharing their perspectives. It's always interesting to talk about these blind spots in operations. Even when they're evergreen content, they're just always so relevant. So I would like to thank you all for sharing your opinions. It was great having you on board.
Thank you, Gabby. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We appreciate it. We'll see y'all soon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.